Everything was at the hurry up. Really? My employers had just taken over a much smaller concern that had recently gone to the wall. I think the company probably got everything on the cheap from the administrators. In spite of my own employer having been very successful in recent months, and completely swamped with work, our management was somewhat in a panic to bring its new acquisition into the fold, and get everything up and running, tickety-boo. To which end, a group of us had been shipped up there to reorient the staff and oversee the installation of our company's systems. In short, it was complete chaos for a couple of weeks. There had been little time to plan anything out and just about everything was happening on the fly. Even down to replacing the new acquisition's computer systems network, which was not extensive enough, and adding all the necessary wiring. In brief, the 10 of us were running about like blue-arsed flies during the days and, quite literally, meeting up in our hotel bar for a while most evenings to plan what was supposed to be happening the following day. None of us lived more than an hour or so away by train, but we were all staying over in town most nights, because of those so necessary evening meetings. One or two of the crew had managed to slip home on the odd evening to see their wives and families, but the choice of who we could afford to have slip away depended on what was happening that day and first thing the following morning. Anyway, feeling pretty knackered, I'd been sitting in the hotel bar for about half an hour waiting for the rest of the crew to show, when she walked into the lounge. Sherry was one of the computer nerds, hired in from a specialist company, helping set up the computer systems and train the staff on how to use them. And boy, did she take me by surprise when I realized exactly who had walked into the bar. Sherry definitely did not look anything like the nerd I knew so well who had been teaching our newly acquired staff how to work our company's systems all day. Dawn was the baggy sweater, calf-length skirt and spectacles, to be replaced by a tantalizingly short skirt and tantalizingly well-fitted silk blouse. She did not look around in case the joint as one might expect. Sherry just settled herself onto a bar stool and ordered a drink. I figured she was waiting for someone, and I suppose, I wondered which of my married colleagues was about to stray from the straight and narrow. Alright, I'll admit it, I was up like a shot from my table and very quickly slipped onto the stool beside Sherry. "Hey, gorgeous, what's a nice girl like you doing in a dive like this?" I asked in as sexy a voice as I could muster. Sherry turned to look my way, I do believe, intending to give me the evil eye and most likely tell me where I could get off, but then she recognized me. "Oh, Christ, Steve, stop messing about. What are you doing in here?" she grinned. "I'm staying here, Sherry," I said as gestured to the barman to put her drink on my tab. "Hey, I asked you first anyway. I'm meeting John, one of those electrician lads, for dinner. He lives in town and he's picking me up here. I thought you computer wallas were all staying at the Connaught." "We are, but John doesn't need to know that, does he?" She winked at me. "Besides, the fewer people know that I date the better. I don't date work colleagues from my own company, it leads to too many complications." "Ah, does that explain why you hide your light under a bushel in the office?" I'm not sure how I should take that. I think I'll assume it was meant as a compliment. It certainly was, Sherry. "On your look now as you sit here, and your skill as a camouflage expert at work. Christ, you scrub up well, girl. Poor John is going to get the shock of his life when he gets here." She grinned at me. "A high proportion of the people I teach how to work our systems are men, Steve. Let's just say they take in instructions far better when they are looking at the monitor and not trying to sneak a peek at my God-given assets. Well, you now know the secret of my success in the business, Steve." Yeah, it was one hell of a surprise when I realized that it was you sitting here. Men, don't give me that one, Steve. I'll lay odds that you watched me every step of the way in here. And that it took you more than a little time to work your gaze up to my face. Yes, I did, I'll admit it, and who could blame me? Sherry, you are one fine example of your gender. What a shame you don't date colleagues. I grinned at her. Steve, you always were a charmer even to that geek in the office. But just remember, you don't work for the same employer as me, so technically we're not work colleagues. What an enchanting idea, Sherry. Except for that one fly in the ointment, I'm married. Damn, just when I thought I was going to get lucky. She grinned. Still, if you ever get tired of married life, you know my company's phone number. We must have joked together in the same manner for about 20 minutes before Sherry's date eventually turned up, and after he'd recovered from the shock, they left together. I bought myself another drink and then went back to my table in the corner to await my colleagues. I don't know, probably 10 or 20 minutes later I went out to the gents. While I was in there, another bloke came and started to use the urinal adjacent to mine. "Pretty girl," he commented. "Sorry?" I said, not really being sure that I'd heard him correctly. It's always a little uncomfortable when a complete stranger starts talking to you in the gents, you just never know what his motives are, but I tried to remain polite. "That young lady you were talking to at the bar, she's a pretty girl," the man clarified. "Yes, she is, isn't she?" "You in town in business?" he asked as I started washing my hands. "Yeah, we're setting up a new branch office in town." "Married?" "Yes, I am, but why are you asking?" "Oh, I was just thinking. Married men who are away from home should look out for who's watching them when they talk to pretty girls in hotel bars." The bloke was washing his hands by then as I dried mine under the air blower. He was confusing me something chronic. I was trying to work out whether he was some weirdo trying to pick me up, or an unlikely-looking pimp, touting for business for his girls. "Are you implying something?" "Yeah. That you've been in the bar 3 evenings this week, and whenever you're in there, so is that little shit over in the other corner, haven't you noticed him?" "No. I really don't know what you are trying to say." "The moment you started talking to that young lady just now, he started fiddling with his phone. And what's more, when you go up to your room in the evening, he moves out into the lobby and hangs around out there until well after midnight." We were exiting the gents by then, and the bloke told me that he couldn't say any more at the moment. He thought the numpty hiding in the corner might have noticed that he'd spotted him. He asked for my mobile number and told me he'd call me in a few minutes, then he walked out of the hotel's front entrance. Confused, I returned to my seat in the bar, still trying to figure out why I'd given a complete stranger my mobile telephone number. True to his word, my mobile rang within a few minutes. It was the bloke, and he told me just to sit quietly and listen. Then he told me an almost incredible story. He went around the houses quite a bit, but the essence of what he told me was that he had recently been stitched up by his now ex-wife. He explained that while away on a business trip, he'd innocently fallen into conversation a pretty young woman sitting at a hotel bar. During their chat, it came out that she had come into the bar to hide from her abusive ex-husband, who she'd managed to spot in the street outside before he'd had a chance to see her. It had not dawned on my gullible new friend that sitting on a stool up at the bar wasn't the most conducive place for her to hide. If he had not been so beguiled by her good looks and story, he probably would have realized that a better choice of seat for her would have been in a dark corner. Anyway, she pointed out marks on her face and arms that led him to believe that someone had recently been violent to her, and consequently he swallowed her tail, hook, line, and bloody sinker. Then she suddenly claimed that her husband was about to enter the bar and fled via a door at the rear. Fearing for her safety, my new friend followed her, and quickly located her trying to hide in an alcove in the corridor. He had suggested that he get her a room for the night where she could hide, but she insisted that she could not go into the hotel's lobby because her ex-husband would most likely see her. Yeah, even I guessed what was coming next. After a lot of discussion, it was decided that the young woman would take his key and would hide in his room, while my new friend booked her a room of her own. Then he'd give her the key and she could hide in there for the night. Which in essence was what happened. The instant he gave the young woman her key, she'd given him a hug and a kiss on the cheek in thanks before he'd escorted to her to the room, and then he'd immediately returned to his own room. He didn't see the young woman the following morning, and brushed the whole incident off as a slightly expensive wander into the realms of old-fashioned chivalry. Feeling quietly pleased with himself, he'd thought the incident was over. But it wasn't. A few days later, while unpacking his suitcase, his wife found a pair of ladies' briefs tucked into the bottom of it. Then all hell broke loose. Within days he was served with divorce papers, and in them he discovered that a certain young lady was admitting to having a sexual liaison with him in the hotel room that night. What's more, there were photographs of him with the young woman in the bar and entering and or leaving his hotel room. He claimed that the whole pantomime had been set up by his wife and her lover, who he'd later discovered had been her superior at the place she'd worked before their children had come along. Although he had no evidence of the fact, and none that his wife had been intimate with the bloke until after their divorce was underway, and they were officially separated. It was all too bloody pat, he said the bastard was round the house giving her the business the evening the judge issued the separation order. And I'd been banned from going near the place because the cow claimed I'd threatened her with violence. Now she's got the house, because I've got to supply accommodation for the kids until they're of age. I've lumbered with child support, alimony and maintenance on the sodding house. And all the while that arsehole is banging my ex-wife in it. I can understand your obvious frustration, my friend, but what has that got to do with me? I asked when he eventually fell silent. Are you sitting in seat at that corner table you and your friends have been using all week? He asked. Yes. Then try not to make it too obvious, but in the corner at the other end of the wall there should be a young lad sitting there on his own. I should imagine he's almost hidden from you behind the damn great triffid of a plant thing. I casually glanced in the direction my new friend had indicated. Sure enough, there was someone behind that plant, but I could not see whom. Yes, I think I see him. Well, I'm not sure what his game is, but that little shit is watching you, my friend. I'm just giving you the nod because you look like a decent enough bloke to me, and I wouldn't like to see you stitched up like I've been. Well, that's most kind of you, my friend. But I don't intend to stray from the righteous path. Neither did I, my friend, and actually I didn't. But that didn't stop me from getting stitched up. For some reason your wife must think you're straying when you are away from home. Never. I'm very rarely away from home actually. This is my first trip in over a year. I informed him. Rather odd then, don't you think? Why else would that lad be following you? Following me? Yes, of course. He has followed you into the hotel for the last 3 nights. Nonsense, my friend, it must be pure coincidence that we both arrived at the hotel about the same time every evening. He's not resident in the hotel. He goes home just after 1 a.m. Look, I can prove it to you. Finish your drink and then leave the hotel. Walk down to the Plume of Feathers, it's only a couple of 100 yards or so. There are plenty of entrances, so if his is watching you, as I believe he is, then he'll have to follow you inside the pub to make sure you don't slip out of one of the others. If you stand up at the bar itself, you'll be able to watch for him to enter, in the mirror behind it. I passed the other boys on my way out of the hotel and told them I'd be back shortly. It was only after I'd walked about halfway to the Plume of Feathers that I'd wondered if I was doing the right thing. After all, there was the distinct possibility that I was setting myself up to be mugged or something. There were sod all in the way of other people about. I made the Plume safely and ordered a pint. Sure enough, the young numpty I'd risked a quick gander at on the way out of the hotel bar came in and bought himself a drink at the far end of the bar. Then he took a seat on the far side of the room from where he could plainly watch me. A couple of minutes later my mobile started ringing again. Was I right, or was I right? Yes, I conceded, he's over by the wall, trying to pretend that he isn't watching me. What are you going to do about him? Buggered if I know. Well, just don't do anything stupid like letting him know that you've spotted him, or chatting up some bit of spare. Let me think on it and I will call you tomorrow. But what if he's, planning on robbing me or something? No, he's not the type. I figure he's a college student, earning some readies, by working for some iffy private detective agency. He certainly has no idea of how to covertly follow anyone. I never spotted him. You, my friend, are a little bit too much like myself. The thought of straying doesn't cross your mind and therefore you don't have any reason to keep looking over your shoulder. Now, your red-headed mate, he's on the make and he's scanning around all the time. I'm a little surprised that he hasn't spotted your shadow. Yes, well, the red-headed colleague of mine he was talking about is actually the office Casanova, and whom I'd first suspected that Sherry was in the hotel to meet. Having finished my pint in the Plume, I made my way back to the hotel by somewhat meandering route that took me along by the river. I hoped that it looked like I was out for an evening stroll to take in some fresh air. Back at the hotel the boys were curious about where I'd disappeared to, but they didn't push me on the subject. Then we got on with looking at office plans and discussing what we hoped we were going to achieve the following day. Later, as I left the bar on the way to my room, I could just discern out of the corner of my eye that someone was hiding behind that bloody plant again. "Are you okay?" my new friend asked when he called me the following afternoon. Yeah, fine, still can't figure out why that kid should be following me though. Do you want to know? Yes, I believe I do. Someone must be paying the bugger, and if my wife's wasting my hard-earned cash, I'll be pretty annoyed. Okay, leave it with me. There's a couple of other divorced husbands working at the office I've been seconded to. I'll have to stay out of sight because the bugger might recognize me, but we think we've got a foolproof plan where they can grab the bugger and ask him what he's about without letting on that you know he's been following you. That'll be a feat, won't it? No, the boys are going to kid him on that they've been employed to follow you as well, and they are going to get stroppy with the lad. Shit, he's only a kid, he'll probably wet his pants. Anyway, they'll promise him that if he comes clean with them, they won't let on to whoever is employing him that he fucked up the job. With any luck, he'll keep his mouth shut rather than risk losing his earner. It was arranged that I take another constitutional around the same time that I had the previous evening. Only this time making my way to the river via a very specific route that took me along a dark alleyway. I'll admit that when I got into that alley I wondered once again whether I'd been conned into walking into something nasty. Halfway down the alley I just caught sight of two dark forms loitering in the shadows. I was somewhat relieved to hear one of them say, "Keep going, he's about 50 yards behind you." Then I continued with my stroll and nothing further of note happened that I was aware of, and someone was back behind the plant once again when I made my way to my room that evening. Well, it worked, but it doesn't make much sense. My new friend's voice said when I answered my mobile phone just after midnight. Oh, he talked then? Boy did he, they couldn't stop him talking. Well, they looked like big blokes to me. In a pitch black alley, at that time of night, everybody looks like a big bloke, my friend. But this, you just aren't going to believe. I know I can't get my head around it. Your little tail has to pick you up from your office every evening. He has to follow you around until midnight, and then when he's satisfied that you've gone to bed, he can knock off and go home. Is that it? Yes, he's moonlighting for a local detective agency as we'd surmised. But they aren't really interested in what you do or where you go, unless it's to the train station. The railway station? Yeah, you know those things that run on rails. Yeah, well, that is how I got up here, no point in bringing the car. Well, the interesting bit is, if you do go to the station, he's to watch which train you get onto. If it's a train going north, he can knock off and go home. If you get on a train going south, well, then he's got a mobile number he has to call immediately. South, you say? Yes, I would assume you live on the south coast, my friend? I do. But why would you get on a train going north? My sister lives about a half hour up the line. I think it's bad news then, don't you? Yeah, have you got the number the lad's supposed to call? I'll text it to you the instant we end this call. Thanks. What are you going to do, my friend? I think I will pay my sister a visit tomorrow night. Do you need any backup? That would be kind of you. I have no idea what I'm going to walk into. Text me the time of the train you'll be going down on tomorrow and we'll meet you at the next station along the line. Oh, and my two friends, if you spot them anywhere, don't acknowledge them, if you understand me? They are complete strangers to you, and it might be safer for everyone if things stayed that way. Is that really necessary? They are two very angry ex-husbands, my friend. You'll only have to give them the nod and they will be only too happy to take care of anything you need after we are safely on the train back up here. I'm sorry? There are CCTV cameras on all the stations nowadays, my friend. Virtually unimpeachable when an alibi is required. I didn't recognize the phone number that my tail was supposed to call. It was a mobile number anyway, so it would probably lead nowhere even if I tried to trace it. The following evening, after traveling one station north, I switched to a southbound train and was joined by my new friend one station down the line from where I'd begun my journey. He informed that the youngster had watched my northbound train go out and then left the STA. Tie-in, presumably to get an early night. I saw no sign of the two large dark shapes I'd passed in the alley the previous evening, and my new friend didn't mention them. We obviously discussed what I might discover when I got to my house, and what we would do if no one proved to be home. My wife hadn't mentioned that she was going out, so we figured that she was expecting company at home. Well, there was always the chance that I'd call for a chat later in the evening. I had done that already once that week, and on reflection my wife had sounded just a little distracted. She had admitted to me that she was in the middle of a TV program and that she had muted the sound on when the telephone rang, and that she was trying to follow the program via the TV subtitle feature. Constance always did follow those stupid soap programs on the telly, so I'd accepted her explanation at the time. By then I wasn't so sure. Actually, I was racking my brain trying to recall what else I'd heard in the background during the call. Some half-heard sound was bugging me, and a couple of times I had thought that maybe Constance had put her hand over the microphone. She'd also giggled at one point in our conversation, but I'd assumed that she was laughing at something in her soap. I looked around, but just the two of us alighted from the train at my home station. My new friend must have noticed. "Don't worry, they're here already. They came down by car earlier." As we began walking towards my house, my companion began to talk to himself. For a few seconds I thought he'd lost his marbles, and then I realized he had one of those Bluetooth do-whatsits in his ear. He was obviously talking to the two dark shadows. He informed me that we'd better hold up somewhere for a while. Constance was still alone, but she was expecting someone. When I inquired how he was so sure, he told me that she'd opened the Integral Garage's door about 5 minutes ago and moved our car out into the street. "Looks like her visitor intends to stay all night," he commented. We wasted a little time looking in shop windows in the town precinct where we couldn't be seen from the road, until my companion was informed that the game was on. Then we made for my house. My companion stopped me from charging in like the proverbial bull in a china shop. He pointed out that tonight probably wasn't the first night Constance had had a visitor, so there was little point in closing the stable door after the horse had bolted. We needed to give them enough time to get well and truly into whatever they were going to get into, so that we could get the evidence I would need when it came to a court battle. My companion obviously had more experience than I in these matters, so I took his advice. We hung around in the back garden for about 20 minutes before my impatience got the better of me. Then I sneaked up to the rear lounge window. Luckily those curtains, that Constance had been so pleased to find, had shrunk ever so slightly when she'd washed them. I'd never got around to getting the steps out again and adjusting the ruffle cord so they completely closed together in the middle. I really would never have thought Constance was capable of it. She was stark naked and kneeling between the legs of an equally naked Tony Copeland. He was one of our local council members no less, and his party's prospective parliamentary candidate for the next general election. Our sitting MP had already announced that he was intending to retire. Quite obviously Constance was performing the act that a certain ex-president of the United States had described as not having sexual relations. I somewhat disagreed. The only way I knew that the tosser was called Tony Copeland, by the way, was because Constance had been delivering circulars for his political party before the last local elections. Constance wasn't a party stalwart or anything, but she had inexplicably become involved in the last local election campaign. Ever since, I've wondered whether Constance's affair with Copeland evolved out of her work for the party during that election, or whether her sudden interest in local politics and the election was a result of her and Copeland's affair. I have to accept that's probably a question I'll never learn the answer to. I suppose I was still pondering that question when my companion pulled me away from the window. The last glimpse I got was of Constance's head going up and down. Copeland had both his hands entangled in her hair, for encouragement I suppose. For obvious reasons I was having a little difficulty controlling my temper. But to be honest with you, and what made it worse for me, was that Constance had always claimed that the mere thought of oral sex made her feel ill. When we were well clear of the house, my companion handed me a small video camera, complete with a lanyard to put around my neck. He explained that when we got in the house I was to keep the camera pointing at Copeland and Constance as long as possible. But should Copeland go to attack me, I should just release the camera and defend myself. He reminded me that the camera would continue recording, even if it were just hanging from the lanyard. And that whatever I said or did, once we got inside the house, I was under no circumstances to make threats of physical violence against either of the perpetrators. If he comes at you, you crack the bugger's head open for all I care, but don't raise a hand to him first. I'll have this camera trained on you all the time to prove that you haven't attacked him, and I'll try to keep this one on both of them all the time as well." "2 cameras?" I asked. Yeah, it's my business, selling video cameras wholesale. Didn't I tell you? You've told me nothing about yourself. I don't even know your name. Probably better that way, if you decide you want the boys to do the business later on. After sneaking into the garage and slowly letting all of Copeland's car tires down, we passed on through the fire door and into the kitchen. From there we could actually see and record what was going on in the lounge, where Copeland was by then returning the favor to Constance. It took all of self-control assisted companion's influence to prevent myself from dashing into the room and using my right boot to ensure Copeland would be singing alto from that day forward, or would it be castrato? Whatever, my helpful friend persuaded me that neither the right boot nor the carving knife from the rack in the kitchen would be conducive to my own long-term well-being. He suggests that HMG's extended holiday homes are places you visit, not establishments you'd wish to be incarcerated within for 10 or 15 years. How the hell Constance never saw us standing there, recording the scene, I just don't understand. Then Copeland seemed to tire of his labor and climbed up to mount Constance, even though she did object by saying that he hadn't got her off yet. Personally, on reflection of course, I thought that was damned unsporting of the fellow. Copeland said something to Constance about not being able to contain himself any longer and started humping away for all he was worth. Somewhat oddly, I thought, Constance told him to take it easy, and kind of inferred that he hurt her when he went at it like that. Their conversation didn't really make very much sense because Copeland interspersed almost every word he spoke with the two words fucking bitch while Constance kept repeating oh fuck. I'd never heard Constance use profanities in all the years I'd known her. Usually when we made love she'd repeatedly chant oh my god. I'd always taken that as a compliment, perhaps I'd been mistaken. Copeland was going at it for several minutes when a mobile phone that was laying on the coffee table began to ring. This caused him to halt screwing Constance for a second and look at the ringing telephone. After a moment's thought he rolled over along the sofa pulling Constance with him so that she was on top and told her to fuck him as he picked up the still ringing phone. Constance, much to my surprise, obliged and began to slowly move herself up and down. Actually, I should imagine that Constance was happier to be on top. Many's the time she'd performed in the same manner above me. However, I could never recall having to drag her into position so uncaringly. The odd thing was that by then Constance was looking into the mirror on the wall behind our sofa, and not far short of staring into my companion and my eyes and our reflections in the bloody thing. God alone knows where her mind was. Copeland put the phone to his ear and said hello. Then things began to get comical. I of course could only hear one side of the conversation. What the caller was saying to him I have no real idea. But I kinda got the gist of it. How did you get this number? Copeland demanded. No, I have nothing I wish to make a statement to any newspaper about. How dare you, young man? If you make accusations like that in your newspaper, young man, I'll have your damn job for you. Constance had stopped her gyrations and was looking down at Copeland. She must have sensed something in his tone. Or maybe what the reporter had said to him had suddenly put Copeland out of the mood for sex and that had had repercussions for a particular part of his anatomy. Now you look here. I'm visiting a local resident on official council business. It's part of my duties as a counselor to assist. That's none of your business, young man. Her husband is well aware that I am here this evening. At this point in Copeland's telephone conversation, Constance's eyes suddenly snapped back to the mirror on the wall, and an expression of horror came over her face. Steve. Oh God, no. Steve. She wailed at the top of her voice. Constance's sudden wail took Copeland by surprise and he looked up at her. I can only assume he realized she was staring at something reflected in the mirror. Because he moved his upper body to one side so that he could see my companion and me. Now there isn't many times in my life that I've seen real fear in somebody's eyes. But I saw fear in Copeland's eyes that night. You know, I don't know whether he disconnected the mobile phone call or not. I do know that in his panic he shoved Constance off himself with such violence that she fell to the floor, smashing the coffee table with her head in the process and briefly knocking her unconscious. I have to say that I've never seen anyone get into a pair of strides back on so quickly. Then Copeland located his jacket and threw that on. My companion used his shoulder to push me further into the lounge as we continued to film Copeland in his rush to leave the house. I realized later that my companion had moved us out of the kitchen doorway to clear Copeland's escape route to the garage where his car was parked. Shoes in one hand and underclothes in the other, Copeland rushed past us out into the garage. I shortly heard him shout, "You bastards!" In the meantime, my companion had told me to check out Constance, but at the same time warned me to keep my camera trained on her while he followed Copeland. I assumed from Copeland's shout that he'd discovered that his car had 4 flat tires. Whatever, I heard the garage roller door open and him attempting to drive away. I was by that time over with the just regaining consciousness Constance, who, having come to her senses, sat up, looked me in the eye and then promptly fainted, giving her head another nasty clout on the floor in the process. From my perspective, Constance did not appear to be having a very good evening of it. I figured that I'd better call for medical assistance for Constance, so still keeping the camera trained on Constance's nude body, I moved over to our landline and dialed 3 9s. Only to be told that an ambulance and the police were already on their way. Indeed, I could hear the sirens before I'd put the telephone receiver down. Rather odd really. I was still standing there filming the by then semi-conscious Constance when the paramedic rushed into the lounge. Time we left, my friend? My companion had returned and was gently urging me towards the door. He also stuffed a pair of sunglasses on my nose and an oversized trilby on my head, which he pulled firmly down onto the sunglasses. I have no idea where he had procured either item and was somewhat surprised that he was now garbed in a similar manner himself. I discovered why as we exited the house through the garage. A TV camera crew, local news I assumed, and several reporters were waiting to pounce. They threw questions too numerous to answer at us as my companion guided me to a waiting taxi. Some other stranger interjected himself between the newspaper people, my companion and myself and kept repeating, "My client has no statement to make at this time." As the taxi drove us to the railway station, I looked across at my companion. "What you told me, was it all bullshit?" I asked him. "No, my wife stitched me up, much as I said." "Her solicitor though?" "Well, he was a right arsehole. You just met him this evening." "Copeland?" "Yep, Copeland." "Then last week a pal of mine who runs a PI business told me that a certain Tony Copeland had got in touch and wanted you watched." "Well, my friend didn't like the look of the job. It didn't make sense to him and Copeland wouldn't explain what it was all about, so he turned the job down. But my friend, knowing the animosity I felt towards Copeland, tipped me off about his desire to be informed if you showed any inclination to return home, unexpected like." Well, it was pretty obvious, wasn't it? It didn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together on what Copeland's game was. "Sorry about the press though, but I wanted to make sure Copeland's political aspirations come to an abrupt end. Hopefully it won't do his legal business much good either. Actually, once they get their claws into Bastard, I'm sure that the media will pretty quickly forget about you and your wife. There's a lot of more juice or muck in Copeland's past for them to get their teeth into." We were on the train heading back north, when my companion informed me that Constance was in the local hospital. A hairline fracture of the skull, his contact thought. Then he asked me if I wanted anything done to Copeland when the police get finished with him. I looked at him, the question in my eyes, and he explained that Copeland had discovered that it's not easy to drive a car with 4 flat tires and he'd crashed into at least 3 parked vehicles and ended up parked in a shop window. Copeland had last been seen being carted off in the back of a police van. My companion, who was obviously still in contact with and receiving messages from eyewitnesses back at the scene through his mobile phone, was a little hazy about the exact reason Copeland had been arrested. He just referred to it as a traffic violation. Seemed reasonable to me at the time. Driving a car with 4 flat tires surely cannot be legal. Later, I gathered from TV and newspaper reports that Copeland had panicked when, as the roller door on the garage had gone up, he'd seen the TV and press people gathered outside. He was standing in the garage in a state of undress and my companion was blocking Copeland's access to the switch that would close the door again. So the panicking Copeland had jumped into his vehicle and driven it away. Or should that be, he attempted to drive it away. The brief description I read in the press said that his car had certainly moved along the road, but it had clipped the TV cruise van as it left my drive and numerous other parked vehicles as it went on along our street. Then, as Copeland had tried to turn into the main road, he apparently collided with a passing truck. It would seem that the collision with the bigger vehicle had imparted Copeland's car with the impetus it needed to embed itself in a shop front. What a shame our taxi had driven off in the other direction that night. I really would like to have seen the carnage firsthand. During our journey, my companion informed me that that evening was probably going to be the last time we met. But he also said that if everything went to plan, I would hear from him sometime in the future. He apologized again for the unfortunate publicity, but said he had needed something spectacular that would set the dogs loose. It was many months before I realized what he was talking about. I'll get back to that later. At one stage, as our train crossed a bridge over a river, my companion threw the mobile phone he'd been using out of the window, telling me that I would no longer be able to contact him via it and nobody else would either. Keep the video camera, I've got plenty more. He grinned. What about the film in those two? I'm sure you've got enough for what you need on the chip in that camera, Steve. I've got plans for the recordings in these, and I might need to stir the pot a little. But don't worry, your wife's face will be kept right out of the papers. Who gives a shit? I said. You do, my friend, and I'm sorry that it's going to happen. No man likes the idea that everybody knows that his wife was a slut who's been hanging it on him for God knows how long. It doesn't do our ego much good, my friend, I can assure you. That's human nature. My companion got off the train a couple of stops before I did. He shook my hand, apologized again for the publicity and for any other repercussions that might inadvertently come my way in the future. He assured me that he'd do his best to negate them, but didn't clarify what he thought might happen. His last act was to give me a business card and tell it was the solicitors who'd been outside my house. He was a good man and could be trusted. I was to use him for my divorce if I decided to go for one and for any other contingencies. Then the train pulled out of the station and I was never to meet him personally again. But I was to hear from him in a roundabout way and see his face again. But I'll tell you about that a little later. The night man on reception caught me as I entered my hotel and handed me a parcel marked urgent. I took it with me into the bar, where to be honest I was planning on having a skinful. Who wouldn't under the circumstances? Ripping the brown paper from the parcel at the bar, I discovered that it contained the manufacturer's packaging for the little video camera that was now in my pocket and a printed note. In essence, the note instructed me not to get drunk. I was to go to my room and make at least one copy of the file from the camera's memory card on my laptop, and preferable several others on any media I had handy. I also suggested that any copies I made and the original were not kept in the same place. Doubting the scotch and the chaser I'd ordered, I did as the note instructed, placing one copy of the file on a DVD that I later took down and deposited in the hotel's safe at the same time as I posted a second to my sister. I could only make the 2 extra copies because I only carry a couple of blank DVDs and CDs around in my laptop case. I suppose that it was morbid curiosity made me watch the pantomime again before I got my head down and tried to get some sleep. In the event, I wasn't completely successful on that score. God alone knows what I looked like the following day, but everyone at the office steered well clear of me if they could help it. Around mid-morning, 2 plain-clothed policemen arrived in the office wanting a quiet chat with me. I took them into an empty office where we had a little privacy. They explained that there was a little controversy over just how Constance, who claimed she could remember nothing of the night before, came to have acquired a fractured skull, even being that it was just a hairline fracture. From the way they spoke, I deduced that somebody had Suggs. Ted, that I'd been behaving rather violently when he last saw Constance and I together. They didn't say who had claimed that, of course, but it wasn't hard for me to guess. They refused to affirm or deny that it had been Copeland. It took me a little time to find the right point in the recording, and then I asked them if they could like to have a copy of it. Actually, they asked to take the original recording, but I told them I had no intention of letting the thing out of my possession. In the end, they accepted a copy that I made while they waited, on a DVD I scrounged from one of the computer lads. While my laptop was doing its thing with the DVD, I arranged for one of the girls to bring us some tea and the officers and I kind of fell into friendly conversation about the previous few days. That's if you can ever have a friendly conversation with an on-duty police officer. They showed great interest in my mysterious friend. But I think it was just curiosity on their part. The video proved that he had not injured Constance either. Actually, the officers were wondering if there was a possible charge against Copeland, for he had pushed Constance off of himself pretty violently. They said they'd get the CPS people to have a good look into that. I think they were just a little interested in who had it in for Copeland, and why. They said that I should watch my back, and suggested that Copeland was a pretty influential solicitor. At the same time kinda inferring that they had reason to suspect that Copeland wasn't exactly kosher in all his activities. Like shagging other people's wives, you mean? I observed. Oh, and much more than that, Steve. We just can't get a handle on the bugger. Let's just say he's unofficially on a lot of police officers' lists of people of interest. But if you don't mind me saying, you appear to be taking all this a little flippantly, Steve. What else am I supposed to do, officer? Lose my cool and start beating my breast? Had I behaved in the manner you suggest that you'd have expected of me, wouldn't you now be leading me out to your car in handcuffs? I asked. Yes, Steve, I expect we would have been. The officer smiled back at me. It's been my experience, officer, that once the stew has been spilt and everything turns to shit on you, the best action to take is laugh, or at least to try to. It really screws with the minds of those who would wish disaster upon you, as well. Both officers laughed and then shook my hand as they left. Later during the day, I went out to find a working telephone box and called the solicitor my friend had suggested. He had been expecting my call and simply asked me if I was going for a divorce right away. When I told him I had little alternative if I wanted to be able to hold my head up in public in the future, he simply said he'd get the ball rolling, and then asked if he could send one of his staff up to see me later in the day. She'd need to get all of Constance and my personal details. I asked him if I should give the woman a check to retain his services, but he informed me that that was already taken care of. Don't ask, Steve, but you'll never receive an invoice for my services. Someone we both have met is intending to stick Copeland with the cost of all this. He comes from a very affluent background, you know. And he's made plenty of cash in his own right, just not all of it strictly legally. That evening all the crew were waiting for me in the bar, obviously hoping that I had calmed down enough and would be ready to tell them about the previous evening. Oh, by then they'd all seen the day's newspapers. I thought it funny that after first thing that morning, I'd seen none of that day's newspapers discarded around the offices. I gave them the short version. I'd gone home and caught Constance making whoopee with Tony Copeland. They asked about all the press coverage, but I denied all knowledge of how it had come about. Hey, that was the truth, I really had no idea about any of it. It was probably about 9 p.m. when my new solicitor's extremely pretty but at the same time very efficient associate or assistant arrived at the hotel to see me. We went into the hotel's library to meet in private. The first thing Miss Clarkson told me, yes, she was one of those types, was that she'd already spoken to Constance and advised her to find a solicitor herself as soon as she was released from hospital. It's far easier for someone's own solicitor to explain to them that they haven't got a leg to stand on. Your wife doesn't want a divorce, you know? Yeah, I know. Will you look at all these texts and messages she sent me today? I replied, showing her my mobile phone. Has she tried to call you? Yes, but I'm rather busy up here. That's what she and Copeland were counting on, I suspect. That's roughly it. Copeland's been after her for some time apparently. She claims that he only succeeded this week, but... well, in my experience, people tend to be economical with the truth when it suits them. Well, he isn't very likely to go to the expense of having someone watch my movements if he hadn't been given reason to believe he'd get the opportunity to bed Constance. Screw, I believe, is the word you were looking for, Mr. Marshall. Steve, Ms. Clarkson, everyone knows me as Steve. Very well, Steve. But I'm afraid that I'm Ms. Clarkson to everybody, except my fiancé. I should imagine a very handsome man. And a very stoic one, Steve, believe me. Oh, I do, Ms. Clarkson, I do. She smiled at me for the first time, cracking the businesslike expression on her face, but then returned to the reason of her visit. Remarkably, she knew nearly everything she needed to know already. Miss Clarkson produced a sheet of paper from her briefcase and reeled off a list of questions. Constance and my full names, date of birth, and our wedding, etc. I saw Miss Clarkson simply placing a tick alongside the correct answers she had already typed up. There were a couple of minor errors, but that was all. Everything was already there, including the value of our house, but not the contents of our bank accounts or details of our savings. Not that I could recall them in detail myself anyway. Then Ms. Clarkson placed a form in front of me for me to sign. It was effectively the contract asking her boss to act on my behalf in the matter of Constance and my divorce and any other legal matter whether it arose from our divorce or not, until I cancelled that contract in writing. Before she left, Ms. Clarkson suggested that I call Constance and speak to her. Actually, I made it verbally clear that I had no intentions of forgiving Constance for her actions. She also told me that I'd be able to find Constance at her sister's house. Your house is being staked out by the press. You might find you'll get a little more peace if you find somewhere else to stay this weekend, Steve. Ms. Clarkson always sounded a little uncomfortable addressing me as Steve. Oh, your employer is doing a good job in being suitably vague about your whereabouts, by the way. I had to wonder who'd asked them to do that, and more importantly when. After Ms. Clarkson had left and I'd been covertly questioned about whom my delectable visitor had been, I went up to my room to call Constance. Oh, the lads had been somewhat shocked when I told them that Ms. Clarkson was a representative of my solicitor. None of them could get their heads around her paying me a visit at that time of night, and kind of queried how much my legal representation was going to cost me. June, Constance's sister, answered the phone. Our conversation was short and concise. All June could think to say was that she personally was sorry for what had happened and she hoped that we could stay friends. Then she said that she'd go and get the silly daft cow. For words that spelt out June's attitude to her sister's behavior, I believe. A year or so later, while on my honeymoon on Malta, by coincidence I ran into June again. But I'll get to that later as well. The press apparently didn't discover where I was until after I'd spent the weekend with my sister and her family. My sister and her husband were very understanding and didn't push me for any details. Shit, they'd probably read most of them in the newspapers anyway. Sunday evening, when I arrived back at the hotel, I was served with an injunction. I couldn't make head nor tail of it, but on the telephone Ms. Clarkson explained that Copeland had obtained an emergency court order forbidding me from releasing any and all media taken on the evening in question to the press, or putting such on the internet. Hey, come on, I can't make head or tail of all the mumbo-jumbo legal crap they talk at the best of times, but at least Ms. Clarkson got the gist of into my thick skull. But I didn't, and I wasn't intending to. I replied. We know, but somebody else has, and still is intending to do his best to embarrass Copeland. Oops. Yes, and you can expect to find yourself summoned to appear before a high court judge sometime tomorrow morning. But don't panic, we've got it covered. I'm pleased to hear you're not panicking. That's what you pay us for. What can a high court judge do to me? Send me to prison? Well, yes, but I told you, we have those angles covered. Monday afternoon I found myself standing in a court dock and confronted by a very pissed-off looking judge. I didn't say a word. My barristers, multiple, dressed in wigs and gowns, did all the talking. Informing the judge that an anonymous third party was in possession of two similar recordings to the one I had and that had been filmed at the same time. Somewhat to my surprise, a police photographic analyst confirmed that the pictures in question were not stills from the recording that I had made. Oh, by the way, the two pictures in question that had somehow come into the hands of the national press. I do believe that, had Copeland done nothing, only the Lou SS reputable and sensational seeking of them would have printed them. And eventually did, along with every other newspaper and media outlet that could lay their hands on the buggers. Both pictures were of Tony Copeland. In one he was peering around the side of Constance's naked body with a surprised expression on his face. In the other, he was in the process of putting his trousers on, while Constance lay naked on the floor behind him. In neither picture could Constance be recognized. The judge appeared to have some difficulty in believing that I had no idea who my mysterious companion had been that evening, and he all but said as much. However, eventually he appeared to accept my brief's arguments. And reminded me, actually informing me, I hadn't understood the court order served on me at the hotel, that there was a temporary moratorium on publication of all recordings made in the house that fateful evening. Then I was told that I was free to go. It was one hell of a struggle, fighting my way past the horde of reporters outside the court building. Copeland had managed to secure an emergency injunction on the grounds that they'd been inside a private residence, and he claimed that he had reasonable cause to expect privacy. Or words to that effect anyway. The newspapers vigorously fought the injunction against publication, and I very much suspect that my legal people had assisted them. When it came before a full court hearing a few days later, the judge had quickly thrown the injunction out. The gist of the judge's judgment was that the property was my house, not Copeland's, and that he could not reasonably expect any privacy within its walls, especially in one of the communal rooms. And, because the people who made the recordings were myself and a guest of mine, even if I didn't know the man from Adam, Copeland could not object to them, in full or part, entering the public domain. Well, I think that was what the judge said. Most likely the whole shenanigans did little but increase the public interest in the story. Because all the newspapers and TV news programs headlined it, and more than I would have expected featured the two pictures and several more that surfaced in the following days. Hey, when they were finally cleared by the courts, the bloody headlines and stories attached to those pictures were brilliant, from my perspective. One of them read, "Caught in the Act," the other, "A Coward's Retreat," the attached story explaining that how Copeland was calmly getting dressed, while his lover lay unconscious on the floor beside him. It was apparent, though, that whoever was lifting the stills from the video and passing them on to the press was being very careful about what they were doing. Constance's face had either been cut out of the frame altogether, or it was effectively blurred out. I suppose you could say that things returned to normal after my escapade with the High Court judge. I finished the second week at the new office and then went back down home. I found that I couldn't stay in the house though, and set myself up temporarily in a small hotel not far from my work. In the meantime, Ms. Clarkson got in touch and informed me that a solicitor working for Constance had made contact with her. From what Ms. Clarkson told me, I gathered Constance was being given a hard time from the press boys. I suppose they must have discovered that she was staying at June's house. Anyway, Ms. Clarkson informed me that Constance's solicitor had told her that his client didn't want a divorce. But if I insisted, Constance was willing to accept the terms I'd offered. "We told him that your name isn't Hamilton," Ms. Clarkson said, actually giggling. "Hamilton." I repeated, having no idea what it was supposed to mean. "Crikey, Steve, get with it. What year is it?" "Trafalgar, Nelson, Lady Hamilton." "Oh, yes, very funny." I lied. I really couldn't get my head around Ms. Clarkson one little bit. Anyway, Ms. Clarkson told me that Constance was in a hurry to get things over with. Perhaps she thought it would somehow lead to the press leaving her alone. But actually, I think the press had moved on to other issues well before our divorce case actually came up. Although it did get small headline on the inside pages of our local press anyway. I'd agreed that everything was to be split right down the middle, providing Constance was prepared to admit that her affair had been the sole cause of our marriage's breakdown. And she would agree to appear as a witness in any further legal action I might choose to take against Copeland. Somewhat surprisingly, Constance's legal people requested that I agree to appear in court as a witness in a case she was bringing against Copeland. This confused me, until Ms. Clarkson informed me that it was probably a personal injury claim, and that the video we had of the event, a copy of which had already been forwarded to Constance's solicitor, would probably be enough for Copeland to settle out of court. I assume he did, because I never heard any more about it. The house sold very quickly. Well, the market was very good back then. Constance had been in to take the few things she wanted, and I had the rest put into storage until such time that I found another house I liked. But I couldn't really be bothered to look. Living in a hotel might not sound like fun, but one gets used to it. It's less work, no cooking or anything, and it worked out cheaper than paying a mortgage. Hey, I even had free parking right in the middle of the town. Sometimes the odd reporter tracked me down, and I was even prepared to talk to them. They didn't really appear to be interested in Constance and me, anyway. They were all asking me what I really knew about my mysterious friend. I'm afraid I could tell them nothing. But a couple of them that I got on really well with, who confided in me that they believed that there was something about Copeland that hadn't come to light yet, and that they thought it must surely concern my mysterious friend. Well, I passed their business cards on to Ms. Clarkson. Although by that time she claimed to have no personal knowledge of the man either. That didn't quite fit with some of the comments she'd made to me earlier in our acquaintance, but she had used the words personal knowledge. I'm not sure, maybe 2 or even 3 months had passed since that fateful evening. It's not really important. Anyway, I was sitting at my desk one day, staring as I usually was at my computer screen, when my desk jiggled as somebody sat on it. I looked to my left and saw a pair of knees covered by gray flannel. Looking further to my left, I noted the flannel material stretch nearly all the way down to a pair of Nike trainers. Working my eyes back up again, I came to an oversized blue jumper, topped by tussle of mousy blonde hair and a pair of gigantic black horn-rimmed spectacles. "Hi, handsome. What's a nice gentleman like you doing in a dive like this?" Sherry asked. "Hi Sherry, long time no see. What are you doing in this neck of the woods?" I replied. Sherry explained that our company had become one of her employer's biggest customers and she'd been assigned to pay us a visit for 1 day a month. Literally to circulate and talk to the actual workers in the various departments. Just to see if there were any program modifications that they might suggest that might make life easier for them. "So what can I do for you? I'm happy with everything as it is." "Yeah, you would be the first to let them upstairs know if you weren't happy." "No Steve, I'm here to collect a debt." I have no idea what kind of expression came on my face, but it led to Sherry giggling. "Hey handsome, you owe me a dinner." "I do?" "Yeah, you sure do. You told me that you couldn't take me out to dinner because you were a married man. And from what I've been reading in the newspapers, you're as good as not married anymore." "I did?" "Well, not in so many words, but that was the gist of what you said in that hotel bar that evening anyway." "It was?" I was trying to keep a confused expression on my face by this time. "Come on Steve, stop messing around." I can't recall what you said to me that evening." "Steve." "Okay, gorgeous. I haven't been out for weeks, it might do me good." "Where do you want to go?" "Oh, nowhere special, I have to catch my train home just after 9. "Now, that is disappointing." "Dinner," I said. "Steve, you behave yourself." "Damn, why do you good-looking ones always say that?" "I'll be in reception when you knock off." She grinned. Then she slid off my desk and left the department. As before, the transformation in Sherry was amazing to behold. There was no missing her as I came out of the lift. Christ, I don't think any male who'd passed through the reception area whilst she'd been waiting for me could have missed seeing her, and most likely wished she was waiting for him. The 2 security guards she was in conversation with, both in the late 50s or early 60s, were obviously enthralled by Sherry. As I got close, she drew away from them and took hold of my arm. "Where we going?" she asked. "My hotel first, I must get changed." "No time handsome, we've got less than 4 hours. My train goes at 9. "But?" "No but Steve. We've got lots to talk about." I acquiesced and, followed by one of the security guards who insisted on carrying Sherry's holdall, we went to my car. Sherry's holdall and briefcase stashed in the boot along with mine, I drove us to a public house, just outside town, that I knew served food all day. We talked for a while and ate an unhurried meal. Sherry not so much demanding, more inviting me to get everything off my chest and air my thoughts. I don't know what it was about Sherry, but I felt I could talk to her, and instinctively knew that what I said would not be common knowledge the following day. When I'd had my say, Sherry took me by surprise by going on the attack and told me why she'd conned an evening meal out of me. "Steve, you've got to do something about yourself, my friend. All the female staff in the office are saying that you aren't the same fun-loving bloke you used to be. Mind you, they all admit that they can't blame you, under the circumstances. But honestly, they'd like to see some sign that the old Steve is still in you." "I'm not with you, Sherry." "No, I don't suppose you can see it yourself. Steve, you've always been a giggle to work with, even I was aware of that, when we've worked on the same projects, 4, 5 times. And even then we've never worked closely together. You do realize that it's been almost standard procedure in your company for all the females to take their man problems to good old Steve in logistics and planning for Yanks? And from what I hear, some of the lads used to seek you out for advice about their wives and girlfriends as well." "They did? That's news to me. Anyway, even if they did, I've not got what you might call a good track record in marital relations anymore, have I?" "Nonsense, Steve, the reason everyone used to come to you was that you showed them how to laugh, well, at least see the funny side and laugh about things. Apparently you were ace when it came to advising the girls about birthday and Christmas presents to get for their men. And you weren't too slow in advising them to dump the no-hopers, or bad at suggesting ways for them to dump them. Did you know, for instance, that, quite unofficially, the girls in human resources tell new girls that if they get any problems with any of the office would be gigolos and they don't want to make an official complaint, then they should seek you out and have a chat? That is news to me, but I can recall. Yes, I suspect you can. But Steve, everybody is scared to say 2 words to you now. They say you walk around the office like a bear with a sore head. They miss the old Steve they can have a laugh and joke with. Look, we all understand that you're upset, but living in that damned hotel and never going out. Well, that just isn't right, for you anyway. You need to get out and, well, start dating again. There are plenty of eligible women around the office. Sherry, I believe I understand what you are saying. But aren't you the one who told me that it's bad news to date work colleagues? Besides, we're out this evening, aren't we? Yes, we're out for dinner, and I asked you out, remember? Yeah, but who's going to finish up paying? I grinned back at her. See? That's the Steve the girls are missing in the office. The bloke who sees the funny side in everything. Even if I am going to order the most expensive dessert they've got on the menu here. Sherry smiled back at me. I get your point, and I'll try to leave my personal troubles at home in future. Do better than that, Steve. Find yourself a nice flat or something and get out in the evenings. Even take the risk of asking some of the eligible females around the office out on a date. Look, I steer clear of my work colleagues because, well, I can look a bit cheap sometimes when I dress up to go out and enjoy myself. Some would-be Romeos take it wrong and think I'm easy. I'm sure you know what I mean. And as I told you before, trying to teach the average male how to use a computer program when he's staring down at my cleavage doesn't usually prove to be very successful. I've found that out from experience. I of course challenged Sherry and told her that she could never look cheap, and we both grinned at each other. Then Sherry ordered her dessert. Not the most expensive on the menu, by the way. Somewhat oddly, after that we talked about Sherry's life and aspirations. I learned that she was 22. Honestly, I'd always thought she was about 19, which was a little bit stupid of me. I'd first met Sherry when we opened an office in Wales, about 18 months before, and she'd known her onions then. For some reason, maybe the way she dressed, I'd somehow thought of her as a perpetual teenager. The first time I'd seen Sherry dressed up to go out had been that evening I told you about, when she was meeting that young electrician lad in the hotel bar. I drove Sherry to the station to catch her train, and she thanked me for a nice meal and an enjoyable evening. Then, as she got onto her train, she said we'd have to do it again sometime. I suppose I must have agreed with her. The next day in the office, I tried my best to plaster a smile on my face when I could remember to. You know, it must have worked. I noted that after a day or so, folks no longer vacated the tea room the instant I stepped in the door, and people who had avoided my desk since, well, they no longer did and often stopped to pass the time of day. That same lunchtime, I visited a few estate agents and got myself a list of furnished flats for rent locally. I think I was still a little shy of buying, and if life in a flat on my own didn't work out, then I could always retreat to the hotel again. Well, I assume that was the thought at the back of my mind. That Thursday, I received an interesting call from Ms. Clarkson. "How does 250,000 sound to you, Steve?" were the first words she said to me. "Sorry, I'm not with you, Ms. Clarkson." Copeland, apparently he's not enthused with all the press coverage he's been getting. That man's got something to hide. Anyway, things are quieting down in the press, and we thought it was about time to hint that an alienation of affection case might be in the offing. I suspect that Constance's legal advisors have threatened something as well, but I can't be sure. Anyway, Copeland's people came back with an offer of 50,000 for us to go away. We've talked it over and they're up to 250 now. We might even squeeze another 25 or so out of the buggers if we take it to the wall. Go for it, Ms. Clarkson, take the bugger for every penny you can. But preferably settle out of court. Constance isn't my favorite person in the world at the moment, but embarrassing her in court doesn't leave me totally unscathed. Very well, Steve. The press will probably get hold of it anyway. But you know the form, an undisclosed sum. Which is almost as good as Copeland admitting he's in. Yes, well, I was going to use your description of him for a moment. Less than a week later, Ms. Clarkson informed me that I would be £300,000 richer once I'd signed on the dotted line. I went straight round there and made my mark. Whilst I was doing so, Miss Clarkson hinted that Constance might soon be buying a new home of her own, and that she'd probably pay for it cash. Miss Clarkson still wasn't sure of what grounds Constance had used to stitch up Copeland, but she suspected that it was probably personal injury. I did move into a pretty reasonable flat a week or so later. It was further from my office but came with free parking, which was at a premium around that area. It was a one-bedroom, with a nice large lounge-cum-diner, and a surprisingly spacious, well-equipped kitchenette. The washing machine and dryer were in the bathroom, but the room was big enough that you hardly noticed them. I'm not sure if it was the cash Copeland had stuffed into my bank accounts or that I tried to take Sherry's advice. But by the end of the month I was feeling a lot better about myself, and I was stopping for a drink after work now and again with some of the lads. There were 3 of us sitting around my desk, a work colleague who hadn't been with the company very long, maybe a month or so, and Bob, my boss. I was just in the process of showing them a spreadsheet I'd been working on, when the computer screen went blank. A second or so later the dreaded blue screen appeared, but it was blank. Then words began to appear in the top left-hand corner, one character at a time. "Hi Steve. Guess who's buried down here in the depths of hell, playing with the servers?" Almost panicking, I rapidly began typing. "Sherry, I'm in the middle of something. I've got people with me." Almost instantly the message came back. "Whoops, sorry folks, official business honestly. Are we on for tonight, Steve?" I was surprised when my boss reached past me and began typing. "Hi Sherry, it's Bob. Of course Steve's taking you out this evening, the bugger don't get out enough nowadays." The message came back. "Cheers Bob. Same place same time Steve. And remember my train goes at 9. Then the screen went blank again, before my spreadsheet reappeared. "Sorry about that," I said to my boss. "About what?" was his reply. Then he added, "Nice girl, that's Sherry." Our new colleague was sitting there with a bewildered expression on his face, but finally asked, "Who's Sherry?" "Someone a little closer to your age than mine." I told him. "Give over Steve." Bob said, "She's just right for you. Christ, you need someone to liven up your life a little." "Bob, I'm 12 years her senior." "So, what's 12 years between friends?" "Christ mate, your mind is too fixated on numbers." After that we got back to the calculations on my spreadsheet again, making small changes here and there and discovering what effect they were going to make to the bottom line. I suppose a half hour must have passed when the spreadsheet vanished again. And another message appeared. "Sorry Steve, I need a chaperone for lunch today. He'll meet you in reception at 12. Bob typed. "Thanks Bob." Came back and then my spreadsheet reappeared. "I will?" I asked Bob, probably annoyed that he'd twice made private appointment on my behalf. "Of course, you will. That was a request for assistance. When have you ever turned a lady down? It doesn't matter who asked you, the old Steve would have said yes. Have I changed that much? No more than to be expected under the circumstance, my friend. But lately we've seen the old Steve slowly returnin'. Gee, now let's get on with these figures." I quickly discovered why Sherry had asked me to go to lunch with her. She had a colleague along who I do believe had aspirations. He was certainly pissed off that I was along cramping his style during their lunch break. I'd say that he was also disappointed to learn that Sherry and I were having dinner together that evening, and consequently wouldn't be traveling back with him on the same train. Sherry made a good job of keeping on the opposite side of her work colleague. Honestly, I was surprised that he wasn't getting the message. But maybe he thought a little too much of himself and his charms, as some young men are wont to do. Later in the day I took a wander down to the depths where the company servers lived and had a quiet word with him when Sherry wasn't around. As I made my way back up to my own floor, it struck that it had been a long time since I'd been forced to have that conversation with any of the gigolos in the building. Sherry looked as delightful as she usually did outside working hours when I met her in reception. The other security guard took the honor of carrying her hold-all to my car that evening. Sherry told me that her work colleague that day was a new bloke with her company, but he knew her from college. Or rather was fully aware of what Sherry looked like in civvies, as she liked to call them. She also thanked me for whatever I'd said to him during the afternoon. That evening we, or rather, Sherry, did a little shopping before we grabbed a quick meal in a fast food joint. I was feeling pretty knackered after walking around all those bloody clothes shops when I put Sherry on her train that night. Is it really necessary for women to try on every piece of clothing that catches their eye? Mind you, I suppose I enjoyed myself watching Sherry coming out of the changing room to ask me how she looked, in what appeared to be ever shorter skirts. You know, fellas, there comes a point when you just have to take the bull by the horns and tell them that the skirt is borderline obscene. And then what do? They buy the bugger. You know, if I'd worked that out a little earlier, I wouldn't have been so hungry when we did finally get into that fast food joint. Over the next 6 months my divorce became final and I kind of got used to living on my own. I was going out with the lads from the office every so often, but most of them were young and on the prowl. Hey, don't get the idea that I wasn't looking, because I was. I just couldn't find anyone who, well, piqued my interest. My dates, well I suppose I could call them dates with Sherry, became a regular thing. Don't go getting the idea that there was anything romantic about them, because there wasn't. Sherry would tell me how her life was going and question me about what I was doing with me spare time. Often chastising me for not asking this or that lady out when I mentioned them. Sherry appeared to have the idea that, if I mentioned a female then I must surely be attracted to her. Which in a way was probably correct, but I couldn't find the inclination to start dating again. I felt like I was too old. When I told Sherry as much, she began teasing me by calling me the old man. It was a morning after Sherry had been down that a newspaper headline caught my eye as I walked to the office. It appeared that Copeland had been arrested the previous day. I purchased a copy and tried to read it as best I could as I walked alone. As usual, with the sub judice laws in the UK, the accompanying story didn't say very much. Just that Copeland had been arrested and charged with conspiracy and perverting the course of justice. The story went on to list a whole group of other people from around the country who had also been arrested. One young lady was accused of perjury, numerous counts. 5 women described as ex-spouses were arrested and charged with conspiring to subvert the course of justice, I think. The newspaper story made mention that several other ex-spouses were believed to have fled the country and extradition papers were being drawn up as the paper went to press. A further 7 people had been charged with various crimes including conspiracy and aiding and abetting. Tantalizingly, the story went on to say that 12 ex-husbands were having their divorce settlements put aside. I gathered that meant they were going to be reassessed on conclusion of the above-listed cases. I can't claim I followed the story, but the gist of it was that same young lady had appeared in numerous divorce cases around the country, claiming to have had an affair with the husbands, and in one case, a wife. In each case the correspondent had come up with a very similar story to the one my mysterious friend had told me all those months before, and in every case a rather large quantity of cash had been involved in the settlement. Eventually I did clap eyes on my mysterious friend again. He was in the background of a piece of news film on the television. The reporter was standing on the steps outside the High Court in London announcing that Copeland and his conspirators had been found guilty on all counts. The following day Sherry was down again. Slightly unusual, I thought, because she usually came down on Thursdays and it was a Tuesday. And what's more, she bounced in my department and waved a couple of theater tickets under my nose. "What are your plans for this evening, Steve?" "Well, nothing really." "Good, you can take me to dinner and then I'm treating you to a show." "You'll miss your train home," I pointed out. "No, I won't, there's one that leaves just after midnight, I'll catch that instead." Then after a few seconds she added, "The last bus will be gone, but my dad will pick me up from the station." The dinner was good and the show was good. On the whole, it was a great evening until we got to the station. We both looked at the departure screen and there was no trains listed as going north until 5 a.m. Sherry went over to the timetable and swore. She'd made a mistake, all the earlier trains left a few minutes after the hour. The last one, for some reason, left at 10 minutes before 12. "Bugger me," she said, "I'll have to stay over. I'll call my old hotel and find out if they have a room," I suggested. "Oh, don't be daft, Steve, I'll bed down on your sofa and catch an early train in the morning." Yeah, we argued the subject. But I could see no harm in her staying at my flat if she wanted to, so we didn't have an all-out ding-dong about it. No, we argued about which of us took the sofa, me trying to play the gentleman. Eventually Sherry trumped all of my arguments by insisting that she'd rather sleep on a station platform bench than force me from my bed. Back at the flat I found a spare sheet and I thought I'd make Sherry a bed up, using my old sleeping bag that I kept in the car for emergencies, as a blanket. Mind you, I had to give it 20 minutes in the tumble dryer. It had been in the boot of my car for a very long time. While the dryer worked its magic, Sherry and I had some tea and she inspected my flat properly. A couple of times previously Sherry had stuck her nose briefly inside my flat, when we'd taken some frozen food and the like I'd bought home, to put in the freezer. Then while she had a shower, I made up what I thought was going to be a damned uncomfortable looking bed on the sofa. Briefly the heated discussion about which of us slept on it did raise its head again, until Sherry repeated her threat of returning to the railway station. Once I'd taken a shower myself, we said goodnight and I went into my bedroom. I do not know what time it was when something awoke me. Yeah, there was no doubt about it, someone was gently blowing in my left ear. "Sherry?" I asked. "Yes, Steve?" "You appear to be in the wrong bed, young lady. Are you objecting, old man, or are you simply stating a fact?" "Stating a fact, I think." "Good. But Sherry." "Steve. If you say one word about the 12-year age gap between us, well, we're not going to start our married life upon a very good footing, are we?" "Married life?" "Yeah, now come on, show me what an old man can do." I was no surprise to me when Sherry didn't dash off to catch a train first thing in the morning. I had finally worked it out that she had set me up, rather efficiently. On our walk to the office Sherry explained that she was down for 4 days, training a new staff intake in the accounts department. In fact, she never went home until the Sunday evening of that week. And she also informed me that there was a vacancy in her company for somebody to be almost permanently assigned to work in mine. Not full-time of course, just 3 days a week, and it'll be very flexible, no problems working around taking children to school and that kind of thing. Sherry added. "Kids?" I gasped. "Of course I want at least 2, and you'll make a great father, Steve." "God, that's all right then." For one horrible minute I thought you were going to say 12. See, that's what I like about you, you always see the lighter side in everything. We were on our honeymoon. It was that time between sessions when you lie there in each other's arms, too excited to sleep, but too knackered to go again, just yet. "Sherry," I asked, "for just how long had you been planning to become my wife?" "Good question, old man. I suppose you could say, since I saw the headline about your first wife and that Copeland bloke in the newspapers." "Oh, that early?" "Yes. But if you were to accuse me of having a devious nature, you even might question my motives for getting that John bloke to pick me up for dinner that evening at the particular hotel I chose. I'd had my eye on you for some time. I'm going to have to watch you, aren't I?" "Yes, old man, but don't go mistaking me for Constance. I know what I want. Tea when I see it, and I will never do anything that might mean I risk losing it." Epilogue. Well, I mentioned that Sherry and I bumped into a very surprised June on Malta, so I suppose I should tell you what she told me. June said that she thought Constance had a latent submissive streak in her that somehow Copeland had recognized and latched onto. June pointed out that from reading the newspapers, she deduced that many of the women involved in his divorce plot appeared to be under the man's influence in some way. I hadn't followed the fine details of the case, so it was news to me. June said that they all appeared to want to take full responsibility for everything, even though Copeland was the one person who featured in every single case. I don't know what that man has got, but he can twist some women around his little finger. June told me. But Constance turned on Copeland and sued him, didn't she? I observed. Constance is my little sister, Steve. I've always looked after her and maybe I'm at fault. It could be that Constance has always been submissive to my wishes. I pushed her into that court case. I don't think she'd have had the nerve to see it through had I not. Luckily Copeland caved and settled out of court. I'm not sure how Constance would have behaved had they faced each other in courtroom. By the way, is that your new bride, Steve? Sure is. Sherry chased me and caught me. She made a very good choice. June smiled back at me.